Hello, I'm Noel. This is Antonia from Boxtail Soup Theatre Company, and this is another Box Tale Scoop.
I thought you were going to say this is the news.
I feel like it is.
Yeah.
I feel like it is. I don't know why. What's different, but I feel like I'm doing the news. So this week we have just very briefly started to go back to looking at Hansel and Gretel. It's a little bit strange to be preparing for a Christmas show and talking about all the snow and all that kind of thing when it's been so hot. But nevertheless, we have, having finished Alice and Brighton Fringe and all that stuff, we've gone back to looking at Hansel and Gretel, and that meant going back to the sketchbook and looking at the ideas that we'd put down in there, and also looking at a couple of the bits and pieces that we'd made already. I don't know when we were working on
last
this,
year,
but
wasn't
yeah,
it?
a good while ago. And then while I was doing that, while I was looking through the sketchbook and looking at the previous ideas, I, as you put it, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole. Pardon the pun, having done Alice in Wonderland. I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole and was flicking through all of the other past designs that are in these couple of sketchbooks. And what caught my eye about it, what I found fascinating and what I thought we would talk about this week, given that we haven't got like the physical stuff from Hansel and Gretel to show you, I thought it was fascinating to look at where we'd started with a lot of the designs for these shows and where we actually ended up. And even for Hansel and Gretel, when I looked at those first drawings, I was like, oh, there's been some evolution here. And then as I flicked back through the book and I looked at the designs for Christmas Carol and for Little Grimm Tales and for Great Grimm Tales, and then I was looking at a couple of things as well with you for the Picture of Dorian Gray, I just thought it was really interesting to see what those initial ideas were and how far or not they were from what we ended up with, and how that had evolved over the course of the process of making the show. So I found that very interesting, and I hoped that other people might too. So
we thought we would show you some of that and show you some of the initial sketches from things, and then obviously photographs of the actual set as it ended up being. There'll be a bit of set and a bit of costume. It's not puppets this time. We haven't got puppet drawings in these books, but it's set and costume. So I think probably, I guess we might as well start with the earliest. I think it's safe to say that when we first started out, we didn't really have the luxury of time to spend time doing lots of drawings and kind of working through ideas in that way. It was more sketching on little bits of paper here and there. So actually, in terms of Northanger, and then even the first Alice that we did, and then I think it wasn't really until we got to the Picture of Dorian Gray that we actually started to try and put things down into a sketchbook properly, so we could actually refer back to them. So, but these drawings are, nonetheless, they're a little bit old. They're not wonderful, but we will show you some first ideas. They should be up on the screen now. We're looking at them here on the table. So, like I said, forgive the rather rudimentary nature of them. They're not the best, but you can see we have our statutory trunk, which we had then thought we might, I said there weren't any puppets, but actually in this bit there are. We thought we might make the puppets up from the things we would have had on the set. That was one of the initial ideas, wasn't it?
Yeah. Which I really, I love these little drawings. I think that's an interesting idea. And sure enough, it was one, in fact, that then, it evolved into something that we used for the final design.
And the idea came from the fact that those characters are very much incidental. A lot of them just appear once and then go. So it was sort of, well, how could you just bring that character together for a moment and then get rid of it quite quickly?
Yeah.
And then on the other page, you can see how that started to evolve. And obviously with the Picture of Dorian Gray, you've got the picture is a very key part of the story. So we tried to think how you might add that to the set in other ways. Maybe there were more pictures in the set, so that's what the sort of hanging thing on the other side is.
And I like the sense that, it's trying to create the atmosphere of the buildings and the kind of feel of the time without being too specific about the location, because obviously we don't want to make one particular set for the ballroom and then have to change everything and go, this is now the dining room of somebody else's house. You want something that is
to be flexible, doesn't it?
Yeah, it just gives you a sense of those locations. And I also like this feeling that maybe, I can't remember what we said about it at the time, but it feels like it sort of echoes the idea of the Picture of Dorian Gray, where you've got some of the sort of the underneath stuff being revealed underneath the nice wallpaper and all.
Yes, you've got the glamorous surface of this sort of sheen of gold and luxurious wallpaper, and then underneath you've got the grit and the kind of ugliness potentially of the brickwork, the real kind of...
You put that much better than I did.
I don't know, I think I got a little lost too. And then you can see, we'll show you an evolution of that now, so that'll be up on your screen now, where we tried a different style of trunk, which in fact is the style of trunk we ended up with. We went for something a little bit more modern.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final drawing, which we'll show you, which is the closest to the actual set. You can see down the side of this drawing, you can see that I've stuck examples of wallpaper patterns and colours. And in fact, what happened with that is it didn't end up on the set, but it ended up in the costume. So those kind of...
Yeah.
The acidy green and that red and pink and those kind of colours. I found this amazing, I think it's a batik, I think that's the technical term. Type of dyeing, yeah, fabric, which we used for the Dorian costumes. And you can see it's evolved now. We've got frames all the way along the back, and that the puppets then, rather than are made from props on the set, become the set.
Yeah, and I love that as a sort of an evolution of that idea. This sense that, yeah, okay, we initially wanted to make them out of the stuff that was physically around, but in the end they became the things that were populating the stage, just as backdrop, as set, as portraits in this gallery, and yet they could come out and come to life, which is really effective, I think.
And then you can see we had a couple of lamps and things in there which did get made. We didn't make a stand to hang them on, we just used them as handheld things to denote it was night time a couple of times.
And I also think that we'll come to this in a moment, but it's interesting to see how some of these ideas then feed into the next things that you work on.
Definitely. So that was the Picture of Dorian Gray, and we'll show you now, or we might have done already, depending on when you decide to put up photographs, but we'll have shown you what the actual set looked like in the show, and you can see how that has come from the drawings. And then I think moving really on to Little Grimm Tales was the next, the Grimms, both the Grimm shows were the next ones we really drew out properly. Though we do have some turn of the screw drawings, but they faded quite a lot because they were only in pencil, so I don't think they really were. This was a birthday present. Here we go. So the drawings at the beginning of this book are for something completely different, which one day we will talk about. But
other projects that haven't yet seen the light of day.
So these are the first ideas for Little Grimm, and you can see we already knew we wanted to have some kind of tree. We'd set the show in a wood called the Grimm Wood, so we knew that. We knew we wanted to have the wood represented in some way.
Yeah, so we'd had this thing of like a fairy tale wood, and that was the kind of basis for the whole thing. And I think this is a lovely idea. I mean, it's a lovely design, and in fact, there is a fair bit of this that has sort of carried through.
It's certainly the style of painting. That's how we painted the trees in that sort of graffiti kind of colour block sort of way.
And then of course we had this interesting sort of idea that the trunks would blend in or would somehow like combine to make other parts and other objects, like these mushrooms here. And actually this one, camouflages itself with the trunk of the tree.
Yeah. And then that we tried, but we always try to do, I think, when we're designing something, is we liked that. I remember when I drew that and you'd drawn something similar and we liked it. And so we sort of thought, I think we're onto something. So then we tried to go the other way. We tried to sort of say, right, well, if we did something completely different to that, what would we do?
Yeah, and I think that's a really useful principle for making anything, anything where you're trying to create something new, is to, even if you like that first idea, give yourself the chance to try something else out. I mean, you've kind of got that in the bank then, if you know that you like that first idea, but it's always worth investigating other things, even if you maybe keep a small element of something else that you come up with, or even if all it does is confirm to you
that you liked your first idea.
Then it's still worth doing.
So this one is definitely a left field idea. We just I was like, okay, well, what happens if we just use green and blue and we make it quite modern, and there is a sense of a tree, but it's very much just made out of the boxes and trunks that you use. And then there were these detachable leaves that you could use. I kind of made a slide there, which I really wish we could have made and just slid down it. I think that would have been fun. But ultimately it was a little bit, we wanted it to be a bit more, it lost a bit of magic, I think.
And it doesn't look as organic.
No,
I think
it
that's the
doesn't.
other thing about it that would frustrate me about that.
And then I think I'm going to skip a couple of pages in here, because actually I then went on to do Great Grimm in between.
We were working on both of those shows at the same time.
And then we had this idea, which is a large tree that looked like one tree, but that was actually 3 or 4 individual trees that would all have different colours and would be used to represent the different stories. Because Little Grimm Tales, our show, is formed of, I think, how many is it, like 4 I think, of the Grimm's fairy tales. So there would be a tree that would represent each of those tales, which is what we ended up with then, really. So we liked that, and then went on to kind of firm up what those individual trees would look like. So you can see here, this is very much what the set then ended up being. We have the blues for the sea hare story, which is obviously set in the seaside. We had this sort of browns and leathery colours for the elves and the shoemaker, and then the green, obviously the greens for the princess and the frog, greens and yellows. And we also had this this gingerbread door with this cake lamp, which we're going to put in our Hansel and Gretel, because I loved my cake lamp, but we never needed
so again,
it.
I mean, what we ended up doing with the Hansel and Gretel part of the story is actually compressing it into, it kind of appears as a song or a rap in the final show.
Yeah.
And it meant that we didn't need something as sort of as expansive or that took up as much of the space for that bit of the story.
No.
But exactly, this design, these ideas have carried over into the stuff for Hansel and Gretel, the full show.
And there are little bits on this drawing that we didn't need in the end. Like we made that crown-shaped window for the frog princess, Princess and the Frog, but we didn't need it in the end. So we cut it, and then the table for the shoemaker we didn't need. We used the upended trunk instead. But the essence of that is very much what we had. And then Great Grimm Tales.
Well, we'll just put up
an
image of the final show as well, so you can actually see the comparison and see what we ended up with for Little Grimm Tales there. And again, I think it really looks beautiful, and it takes that original idea and has done something lovely with it. So there's a couple of pages back here, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, I think I started there. I think that was it? Oh, no, quite a few pages back.
Yeah, quite a few pages.
This is the start of it, I think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, we wanted, Great Grimm Tales is also, it's set in a graveyard. The first story that we use, which is sort of the wraparound story for the whole show, is a story called The Grave Mound, and it's set in a graveyard. So we wanted a tree again. We kept seeing a tree.
Well, I think we were also conscious that they were sister shows.
Yes.
We were creating them at the same time. One of them was for families, one of them was for adults, but they were from the same source material. So we quite liked the idea that there were echoes of one in the other. Not that necessarily means anybody would have gone to see both.
No.
Maybe there are people who've seen both, but we just like the sense that there is some connection between the two.
Yeah.
So in this graveyard, and we wanted to have a tree in there.
And we there's a fire. They light a fire at the beginning, and it's part of the whole. It's quite a sort of centre, a focal point for. Actually, it's in the other stories as well. So we're trying to work out how we could do the fire. One idea was to house it in a trunk, so that it would also, we'd have like a mini smoke machine and a light, I think, at one point. But in the end, practicalities of that, we decided against it purely because we needed to move the trunk a lot.
Yeah, I mean, and that would be very limiting then, because really that trunk couldn't be moved.
It would just be the fire.
Else, yeah.
And then I'd done things where, again, a bit like the blending of the first Little Grimm tree into the trunk, we'd tried that idea here where the roots of this tree went over the trunk was part of the gate, the trunks were part of the gate, which was also part of the tree. So that was those first ones. And then again, we did the same thing, and we're like, okay, we think we like this tree, actually, but what else could we do? And we have some wonderful music for that show. And by that point, Dan had sent us a few tracks, and they were this kind of bluesy sort of.
Yeah, it's a kind of very
Slightly rocky,
electric blues sort of feel.
So we were like, okay, well, what if we went a bit
Tom
down
Waitsy,
that way? So then I drew this microphone stand tree.
Yeah, because I think we'd had this discussion about whether, given that these were stories that are, Grimm Tales, it's very much reported stories or stories that are passed on or stories that somebody turns up and, a storyteller delivers them. So we had this thought about, well, what if you modernise that slightly and have it actually delivered in some way at a microphone, or use that sort of idea of the blues man on his own on stage in the spotlight with the microphone telling this story about beating the devil or whatever it might be. So we turned the tree into a tree made out of microphone stands.
Of course, I mean, why not? And then there was the idea that they would split apart and potentially they could become the shape of a fence. I mean, it was all very, very abstract. And then I drew this sort of design on the trunks and the boxes that was based around a tattoo that I'd found of this skull that had a tree growing out of the top of it, which again I just sort of thought was quite rocky. And so that was our left field, which then led into us kind of going back to this more traditional trees, more traditional gates. So that was that.
Yeah, we're really just exploring those ideas there and looking at different combinations and ways that we could make them, or make shapes with them, make other parts of the story with them.
And then obviously I moved on to Little Grimm, but then here we started to frame it up more. So in this grid you can see the angular tree in the top corner was based around trying to merge the microphone stands with the tree to see whether we liked that. But we decided it was just we wanted it to be a bit more natural than that. It was too far. And then you can see the one next to it was the compromise, which is basically what we ended up with. So it was 3 trees, one white, one black, one grey.
Yeah.
And that they would then move apart and they would...
So, and in fact, there's another good example of where, designs from one show feed into another. Because what we didn't end up with from Little Grimm was that idea of having one tree made of all the other trees.
Although we sort of do, because when we set them up at the beginning, they're set up in a kind of trio in the
middle.
middle.
A bunch, yeah. But
this
you're
right,
sort of
this
design
is more like that.
Very much, that's exactly what we ended up for Great Grimm, was the fact that they could all combine together and make this
one large tree. Or they could be 3 separate ones, and that the separate ones would then make shapes together. So we very much were careful about the bend of the branches in the end, weren't we? So that we could create arches and that we could... Yeah. We spent quite a long time. They would be
useful, for making other shapes and for combining with each other in interesting ways.
And then these gates, it wasn't until the very, very last minute that we cut them.
I think it was
you were very much up for making them.
I was really interested in what we could do with the gates, and what we could make with them that was, especially when you've got this organic shape of the tree, and then you can make this sort of more constructed, straight-edged thing with these gates, or a castle wall, or an actual, the gates themselves. I think we even got to the beginning of rehearsals and had some sheets of uncut foam board that we were experimenting with, still kind of going, well, maybe we could use these.
Because we never like to dismiss something too soon. You have to see it through, but it was just too many things. There were too many things to move around.
And it wasn't necessary.
No, but what we did end up with, the gravestone that is in the drawing, we did then use that more. So we thought, well, we don't want to have a gravestone, there's just a gravestone, what else can it be? And then in the show that transforms and is various other elements for each story, so it appears in each story.
And is there one more?
No, that's it. But then it's costumes.
Okay, so
here's the set, the actual set for Great Grimm Tales. And the set obviously was very monochrome, so we then added the colour in the costumes. Yeah.
And again, we sort of used the different stories just to add a splash of colour to a different colour to each one, which is something that, again, you don't necessarily notice or pick up on as an audience member. I mean, you'd have to be a little bit unobservant, but it still connects those stories together visually, and you feel like you're in each story as you go along, they're clearly separated like that.
And I think we'll skip the costumes, otherwise this vlog is going to be epic.
Yeah, sure.
So very briefly then now, because you have actually seen a lot of this, we then, it was Christmas Carol next, obviously. And so here's a very initial idea for a Christmas Carol. It was to do with steps and windows and a clock. I had this real image of a clock in my head. We never used it.
And you took a while to let go of the image of the clock.
Yeah, I did.
On that for quite a long time.
Because I quite liked, and it was when we were trying to make a set that was dual purpose. So the clock was then going to be a moon.
Yeah.
In the other show.
Yeah.
For Hansel and Gretel, and it was quite nice, but it was just not necessary. We didn't need a clock. And then we moved on to these ideas, which you can see, these are the ones I think you were referring to earlier when you said they relate to Dorian Gray. Yeah. So you can see on this drawing the sort of broken up walls and just sort of half windows and half curtains, etc.
Yeah, I very much feel like we sort of, I don't remember whether we went back and looked at them or not, but I feel like we sort of reached back to that and went, we had that sense of creating the corners of rooms and just a sense of the beginnings of the walls so that you can mentally fill in the rest of the picture.
And you can see the ideas that, we had this idea of a dropping down bookshelf, which did stay in the show. And these money boxes did definitely stay in the show. And then, this was left, again, trying to do something different. I started to draw a bed, and that if you had a bed, because the whole thing, obviously Scrooge is going to bed and then he's going off with these spirits, I thought, well, if you could centre it around the bed, the four-poster bed, so then the blocks would move out.
And you would always, it's the fact that you always return to the bedroom, that he comes back and wakes up after each one.
I don't like it. I didn't like it, but I thought I would draw it.
But I feel like there's an element of this.
Yes, we liked the bed posts, and we sort of thought, well, how could we use those? Trying to be more simple, using blocks and trunks to see what they would make. I'm going to skip through these relatively quickly because otherwise we're going to be here all day. But and then a giant fireplace, which had layers in it. We were trying to think of something that was going to be the focal point of the back of the stage, and we would like to door, and then we thought, well, what about a fireplace? Tried that, but the pillars could become lampposts, the middle could become a door, etc. Then we start to hone in a little bit more with these. So we've got these lampposts that then become the posts for Scrooge's desk. That did stay.
So that made it in.
Yeah. And these lampposts here again being used to string. It was to string something for Fezziwig's party. We used bunting in the show. Again, the drop-down bookshelf, which is the schoolroom. And then here's another drawing with the lamppost showing there was going to be chains going through them for the Ghost of Christmas Future. We didn't need that in the end. In fact, what worked nicely was it was quite stark.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about a lot of these drawings is that in most cases there's one idea, one key little thing that we took from each one and went, oh, you know what, that's enough.
Yeah, like the Ghost of Christmas Present, this top one here with all this holly garland, that became the wreath on his head, and that was enough.
The Cratchits,
we used the Christmas dinner.
We used the Christmas dinner. We do have a little bit of washing that comes out, but we lost this idea of having, a stove or a fireplace.
Yeah, it's just one too many beats, wasn't it, for setting up. And then here you just get the idea of how we started working on this door and the sign, and how we were going to use the money boxes in this sort of stacking way with windows that were part windows. And this is what we then ended up with in the final show. And you can see the colours. We definitely stuck to those antique kind of green, red, blue colours, because we didn't want all the money boxes to be black. And we kept the gold in, which works really nicely. And we kept the sense of those shades, I think, for each of the...
And so again, we separated the ghosts and the different sections for past, present and future subtly by using those slightly different palettes of colours.
So here's then the set for Christmas Carol, which obviously you've probably seen. If you've watched any of those more recent vlogs, you will have seen those at the end of last year. And so we're now going to be moving on to Hansel and Gretel next week.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, we're basically working, we've got about 6 weeks, I think, of making. We're hoping to get the whole show made in that time, as much as we can anyway, and then we've got a week of R&D on it, so that we can basically make the show. We're hoping, the bare bones, at least get the sort of skeleton of it together, and then we'll rehearse it properly before we go and do the run in the Everyman in November.
And already there are interesting little things that have come about because of taking that break and going to work on Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The way that we made the puppets for Alice are now kind of influencing what we're thinking about the puppets for Hansel and Gretel. So even some of the ones that we've already started building prototypes and you know, made it a fair way down the line with, we're thinking now we might actually change how we're going to approach that. So that's just another, you know, one of those things where each thing that you do feeds into the next and builds on the stuff that you've done before. I think the other thing we wanted to mention was just that the key thing about all of these drawings at the very beginning in particular is that you can block what you're doing. And we've said this before, I think. You can run into problems when you start to question yourself too soon and say, yeah, but how are we going to do that? Or, well, you know, that's not going to work, is it? You know, that's not practical, or how are we going to make something like that? Those are not questions to be answered right at the very beginning. At the beginning is that time to just let all of the ideas out, let it all splurge out onto paper, and you can worry about the practical side of things later on down the line.
So I think it's high time that we stopped this vlog, because I feel like it's been a bit of an epic. We may even need to split it into two, who knows? But thank you very much for watching. If you've got this far, well done. And please do like, comment, subscribe, and all of that kind of thing. And we will see you next week to talk about our progress on Hansel and Gretel.
Thanks.